How's it going? This is just a video that is going over some of the major review vocab list for the Unit 3 exam. So with the Unit 3 exam being so many points and being a large chunk of the AP exam, I'm just going to go through most of the vocab terms and concepts of the unit overall. Specifically, I kind of chunk this unit into what I would say four major chunks. We have the cognition and paying attention section. We have the problem solving section, we have the memory section, and then we have the IQ intelligence section. So without further ado, let's kind of go through each one of these vocab words really quickly, just to give you something to kind of recap tonight and prepare for that exam tomorrow. So first things first, when we talk about cognition, cognition basically is just the concept of thinking, thoughts, feelings, and emotions, anything that's inside your head. I always think of cognition as just thinking in general. So a few terms that kind of stick out to start is bottom-up versus top-down processing. The difference between these terms is bottom-up processing means that you're taking in the world with no past experience. Think of when you get a new toy or you find a rock outside as a kid that you've never seen before. You examine it with all your senses. You might feel it. You might move it around. Basically, you have no idea or concept of what this thing is. You're truly building up from the bottom up. Now, if you have experience or you have any comprehension of what an object is, that is a top-down process. So, for example, if you're an artist and you see a bunch of different brushes, paint palettes, and more, you might be grabbing those items with a plan. With your past experience, you might be planning or organizing a drawing or a project or something. Basically, you have an understanding or experience with what this object is. Now, perceptual set is our third term, and this will be on the AP exam. Basically is the idea that we tend to see one thing over another based on recent experiences. So, for example, if I am talking about how scary an upcoming movie is, and then we go see that movie together, you might be more afraid or scared during that movie because your perception has been set to kind of expect that sensation. So even if the movie isn't that scary, you've already been, in a sense, primed to feel that way for the film, which will make you react that way, being more frightened than you usually would be. Now, the terms schema and prototype kind of go hand in hand. Schema is like a giant basket of everything you know about a topic. So, for example, everything you know about what makes a dog, or what makes a chair, or a school is a schema. It's kind of every experience or thing that you've heard about a topic that is stuffed into a mental folder of the mind. And a prototype is that first example that comes up when we think of something in our schema. So when we think of a dog, that first image that goes into your mind is your prototype. If you're thinking about fruit and inside your mind just appeared a lemon, that is your prototype, the first example that comes to mind of our schema. Now, assimilation and accommodation, this involves our schema as well. Assimilation is basically adding things to the schema, even if they don't fit. So, for example, maybe you have a schema of horses and you see a zebra. Now, it looks like a horse, so a child might call that zebra a horse, despite it being a zebra. Now, accommodation is when we make a new schema and adjust our mindsets based on information that we're exposed to. If somebody tells a child that that zebra is not a horse, it is a zebra, they just created a new schema inside their mind. Zebra. So accommodation basically is when something doesn't fit inside our original schemas, we make a new one to kind of be able to kind of contain that new information. Moving on now to the encoding process. This is a theory basically explaining how information goes into our mind, goes into our brain, and then how we remember it. And there's three major parts. We have encoding, which is taking in information. Think of encoding as just paying attention. Storage is when we have information in our mind, it's stored inside of there. And retrieval is when we remember it. So retrieval, think of like you're retrieving that memory that is stored deep in the files of your mind for you to remember. So encoding is taking in information, paying attention. Storage is holding on to that info. And retrieval is remembering it. Now, these terms, selective attention, cocktail party effect, inattentional blindness, and change blindness are all going to be an aspect of the exam as well. Selective attention means that you can focus on one thing and ignore everything else. If you're paying attention to the television in your room, but there's a lawnmower outside, the fans, making a bunch of noise on the ceiling, all those other ambient sounds are ignored. Maybe you smell cookies inside your house and you ignore all the other smells that are inside. Basically, you're selecting what you want to focus on. Cocktail party effect is the idea that while we're paying attention to something in, like, for example, a crowded room, there's certain words like our name, or different words that might catch our attention. Perhaps like a swear or some juicy gossip or something. Basically, these interesting stimuli sounds catch our attention and divert our attention to something new. Now, the difference between inattentional and change blindness is inattentional blindness means you don't notice something in your surroundings at all. Your selective attention just ignores it. It was there the whole time. So, for example, a Christmas tree in the back of the classroom every day. If you never noticed that, that's an example of inattentional blindness. You just never noticed it. But change blindness means you don't notice a change. If somebody falls asleep in class and you didn't notice, that's a change in your environment. Somebody was awake and then they were asleep. But if you don't notice that change, that's an example of change blindness. Now, binocular and monocular cues are other terms that kind of come to mind as well at this time as pretty important terms when it comes to this unit. So binocular cues basically are when we're using two of our eyes. So think of binocular, you have two lenses. Monocular cues is when we look with one eye. Think of like a monocle or mono. So two types of binocular cues is the retinal disparity and convergence. Retinal disparity means that we see the world on two different angles because we have two different eyes. So if you close one eye and then switch eyes, our vision kind of shifts over a few kind of like millimeters, and that's because we view the world differently with both eyes. Convergence means that our eyes, when things get close to our face, point inward. So if you would take your finger and slowly point it towards your nose, your eyes are going to slowly turn inwards to kind of keep an eye on that object. So that's convergence. So if there's a question on the exam that asks you, if somebody lost an eye, for example, or only have one eye, what would be affected? It would be these two terms, retinal disparity and convergence. These are the ones that involve specifically two eyeballs. Now, monocular cues are one eyeball things. So, for example, we have relative size, which is when we showed in a class the examples of the pool balls, for example, as well as the soccer balls. Objects that are larger than other ones, we basically make the assumption that they're closer to us. If a bus is next to you, it's a lot bigger than a bus that is 2 miles away down the road. So size, the bigger it is, the closer it is. The smaller it is, the farther it is. Relative clarity is very similar. Objects that are very clear and very detailed are close to us, but objects that are far away, for example, like that bus, might be blurry and lacking detail. Texture gradient means that we'll see a lot more detailed texture with close objects, but a smooth blend of texture for farther objects. Think of like the ocean. You can see the choppy waves up close, but when you look off in the distance, it's smooth blue water. Linear perspective, that's in art, for example, when two parallel lines going the same straight direction look like they're coming together in the middle of a painting or in the middle of an art piece. Interposition just means that overlapping objects, if an object looks like it is overlapped in front of another one, it's closer to us. So if I'm standing in front of a pole, I am closer to you than the pole. That's interposition. Perceptual constancy means that an object's the same even if we change the distance or the angle of it. If I show you an apple and then walk 10 feet away and flip it upside down, you can still recognize it as an apple. Your perception or understanding of that object is constantly there. Apparent motion means it looks like there's movement even though there is none at all. Think of apparent motion like a flip book. As it kind of flips through, it makes it look like it's moving around like a video, when in reality it is not. All right, moving on to section 2 now. Now this is all about memory and problem solving. So this is a big aspect of the upcoming exam. So let's kind of break through and talk about this. Algorithm heuristics, the opposites of each other. Algorithm is a specific step-by-step way to solve a problem. It's guaranteed to give you an answer, but it takes a long time. If you're trying to find your car in a parking lot and you're parked somewhere in there, an algorithm would be, okay, I'm going to start with the first spot I see and go one by one by one by one until I find my car, even if I know I'm not in that section of the parking lot. It's long, it's tedious, but it gives you the right answer. Heuristics are shortcuts. They're faster, they're super efficient, and for like low level or low stake problems, it's the best way to solve them. The problem though is they're inaccurate at times. Sometimes we have issues with these shortcuts. So, a heuristic example of that parking lot would be instead of looking at every parking spot, you would remember the number of where your parking spot was, and you would look around that area. So, it's a shortcut, it saves you a lot of time, but there could be issues, such as representative heuristic and availability heuristic. The difference between these two kind of shortcuts is representative heuristic means that we make an educated judgment based on stereotypes. If we're trying to find directions for somewhere and we see an old lady and then we see a guy who has tattoos and a bunch of piercings, we're probably going to go with the stereotype of asking the old lady for help because she seems like less of a threat. So the representation of an old lady is kind, thoughtful, intelligent. But if we see somebody who is jacked with tattoos, we might think, dangerous or threat. Now, availability heuristic means that you're making a judgment on recent news. So, for example, maybe you saw something in the news that flying is dangerous. Somebody got in an accident, for example. You might stay away from planes when in reality, most flights are completely safe. But that shocking or recent news makes us think that shortcut way, flying equals dangerous. Now, priming and framing are very similar as well. Priming is when you prepare the mind to think a certain way. So, for example, if I show you the color yellow, for example, and I show you that for about 2 hours and I ask you to name a fruit, you're more likely to say a lemon, for example, or a banana because you're used to that color yellow subconsciously. Another example could be if you watch a cartoon of a tiger and I show you a drawing and I ask you what it looks like and you say it looks like a tiger, that means that your brain was prepared to think about tigers throughout the day, so you're more likely to say the word tiger. Now, the fallacies are gambler's fallacy and sunk cost fallacy. The difference is gambler's fallacy is the myth that the more you gamble, the odds are going to change. When in reality, a 50-50 coin flip will always be 50-50. Just because you flip it 7 times doesn't mean the odds change. Now, sunk cost fallacy is the myth that the more efforts, money, or work you put into something or emotions, it means you have to stick with it. So maybe it's a sport, maybe it's a bunch of money you put into a car or a relationship emotionally. The more stuff you put in, you're less likely to quit or kind of leave that situation. You're kind of sunk with the cost that you put in, so you can't get out of it like quicksand. Now, convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is when you break down to a single answer. So maybe a mathematician is trying to break a formula into one answer. But divergent is when we want to work from a problem into multiple different ideas or solutions. So maybe you're working for a company looking to rebrand a mascot, and you come up with 7 different options, and then you pick the best one. Kind of gives you more flexibility and creativity than convergent thinking. Now, executive functions means the complex stuff that your brain does. That frontal lobe when it does critical thinking, planning, and problem solving like we're talking about today. And the last 2 terms for this section is mental set and functional fixedness. Mental set means that you're fixing a problem the same way over and over again, and it's hard for you to try something different. So if you always turn on your computer by slapping the keyboard, you're going to do that every time. And even if it doesn't work, you're going to try to slap that keyboard. If a door opens a certain way, you're going to try to always open up that door the same way. We also have something called functional fixedness, and this is the term that you use an object for its intended purpose. A pen is used for drawing. But if you're creative, you might use a pen as a utensil. You might use it to keep a door open or a weapon, for example. But if you're functionally fixed, you would only use that pen as a writing utensil. All right, moving on to memory types. Now, this will be a big part of the exam, so I would focus on this part as well. Memory basically is your ability to store knowledge and retrieve it when you need to. And there's several different types. You have explicit and implicit. Explicit are memories you actually have to try to remember, like test answers. Implicit are memories you don't have to actually think about, like riding a bike, walking, tying your shoes. Your body just knows how to do it. It remembers how to do it. But the different memories I want to focus on is episodic, semantic, procedural, and perspective. An episodic memory is like an episode of your life. Just think of like a little TV show of an experience or a memory that you have. For example, your graduation or your first date or things like that are episodic memories. Semantic ones are facts and things you've learned in school and in life. Trivia, for example, or things you saw on Google. Knowing the capital of Illinois is an example of a semantic memory. Procedural memories are memories that involve your motor functions or muscle movements. So, for example, when you learn how to tie a knot or tie a shoe or ride a bike, things like that are examples of procedural memories. Once you learn it, you don't have to think about doing it again. Your body just knows how to do it based on that old memory. And perspective memories are the last one for this section. Perspective memories, when you remember to do something in the future, or you remember something generally just in the future. So, for example, if you remember to study for a test tomorrow, that's a perspective memory. If you remember that tomorrow is, for example, Thursday, that's an example of a perspective memory. You remembered something that is happening in the future. Now, working memory is basically like holding water in your hand. It's holding on to a memory for a very short period of time to do some type of task. So, like to solve a problem, etc. That is working memory. So, if I give you a combination, your brain's going to only hold on to that for a little bit just to do whatever task is needed. There are major parts of this: central executive, phonological loop, and visual spatial sketchpad. Here are the differences. Just know that the central executive is the big organizer. It helps decide, are we going to use our thoughts or a visual kind of representation in our mind? What are we going to do to remember this information? It's kind of like just the boss, the executive. Phonological loop is when we use that audio, like we just said, like repeating something in your head over and over again is a phonological loop. It's looping back and forth inside your mind, repeated. Visual spatial sketchpad, though, is when you can mentally visualize, for example, the order of cards on a table or some type of drawing or image in your mind. Basically, you're doing a quick sketch to keep that in your memory for as long as you need it. So, for example, if I described a classroom door for you to find, you might have an image of that in your mind that you hold on to until you find that door. Or if I'm trying to tell you to find a faculty member and I tell you and I describe how they look, you're going to use that visual image in your mind until you find them. All right, moving on now to the multi-store model. You do not need to know how to draw this or the exact specific parts, but I'll give you kind of the general gist of what you do need to know. Basically, know that we take in sensory information, and if we don't pay attention to it, we never perceive it, it just is forgotten. However, if we pay attention, it goes into our short-term memory. If it's not important, we forget it, but if it is important, we practice it over and over again through a process that's called rehearsal. That's just practice. You're practicing studying or learning different things in class, and once it gets strong enough, it transfers to our long-term memory, and that's kind of like our forever limitless bank. We have unlimited long-term memory. Our short-term memory only has a limited capacity. It's like barely having storage on your phone, basically, where your long-term memory is like getting a giant hard drive where you can put as many videos or video games on as you want, for example. Now, some important vocab that we kind of paid attention to is rehearsal is practicing things over and over again. Retrieval is remembering things. You retrieve that memory from your mind. Now, this concept of memory consolidation means that we're turning these experiences into long-term memories. Typically, we do this while we dream and sleep, but we can do it throughout the day as well. We're just kind of transferring over that short-term memory into a forever long-term memory. Now, moving on now to the levels of processing. Basically, it's the level of understanding of something. And there's three levels: the weak level structural, the medium level phonemic, and the high level semantic. Structural is the low level. It's like we can visually know what it looks like. If I give you a word like hippocampus, a structural processing level is like, I know the word starts with H. I know the word hippo is in it. There's no like real processing or understanding. You just know what the word looks like. Phonemic is the audio, what it sounds like. Maybe, it sounds like hippocampus, for example. Or you make rhymes out of it, for example, but you don't know the meaning behind it or anything, but you're a little bit farther down the understanding than just knowing what the word starts with for structural. Semantic is when you know like the definition, the highest level of processing. You can use it in a sentence or a real life example. Semantic means you've like mastered that ability. All right, now moving on now to the mnemonic cues. These are like study strategies that we talked about in class. Mnemonics are those little shortcut cheat codes that we said, like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Or another example would be like homes for the lakes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Superior. Chunking is when we take information and put it into bite-sized pieces. Think of like a book. They put it in chapters to give you bite-sized pieces. Think of phone numbers. The reason why they're broken up into 3 digits is to make them easier for you to remember. In classes, that's the reason why you have units, for example, as well. Categorization is where you put information into groups. Like if you have a bunch of different animals, you might put them into groups of dogs, groups of fish, groups of reptiles, for example, to make it easier to remember. If we have 50 terms, but we break them 10, 10, 10, 10, it's easier to remember that than 50 all at once, for example. It's almost, in a sense, kind of like chunking. Hierarchy is when you take terms from a general idea to a specific. So you're breaking more specific, for example. So maybe you say job, then you say education, then you say teacher, then you say high school teacher, social studies high school teacher, social studies high school teacher for seniors, for example. You're going from something very general to very specific. Now when we talk about space and effect and mass practice, these are different ways that you can study or practice remembering things. Space and effect means the best way to practice studying something is to space out your studying over time. Don't study all in one day. Do an hour today, an hour tomorrow, and an hour the next day. It gives your brain time to recover and take that information while you sleep and put it into your long-term memory. But mass practice is when you do that long, late-night cramming study session all in one try, and it's good for short term. So if you have a test that morning, it might be able to help you, but long term, it's not going to stick around. Your brain's basically going to get exhausted from what, in essence, is a very long workout. Serial position effect is our next term here for mnemonic cues, and that is we typically remember best the beginning and end of information. Primacy, meaning the beginning, recency, a vocab term meaning the end, we basically remember these chunks of information. If I give you a list of 1,000 numbers, primacy means you're going to remember the beginning, maybe 5 or 6 numbers, and recency means you're going to remember the last 5 or 6 numbers. But overall, this concept is called the serial positioning effect, remembering the beginning and the end. Now, with storing memories, we have rehearsal, which just means practice. And you can either do maintenance rehearsal, which is very weak, you're just repeating the information over and over again, or elaborative rehearsal, which is more complex. This is when you might quiz yourself or make examples or put them in sentences. You're going the next step of understanding with this. Now, we talked about remembering your life story, and that's the autobiographical memory. When somebody wants to write their life story, like as a book, it's called an autobiography, because you're writing everything you know about your life story. The superior version just means you know all of your life details and stories and memories, for example. Now, we've talked so far a lot today about memory and things like that. Now let's talk a little bit about the forgetting aspects. So forgetting in itself is the term amnesia. Amnesia means forgetting information. And there's 3 types I want you to know for the exam. We have infantile amnesia, which just means you don't remember the early years of life. You're a child, you're a baby, your hippocampus isn't fully developed yet, so you don't remember anything from those early 1 to 2 years. Then we have retrograde amnesia, which means maybe from an injury or a lesion, you don't remember anything from the past. So you don't remember anything from your childhood or a year ago or sometimes even a day ago. Anterograde is not remembering anything new or the future. So you remember everything from before the accident, for example, but after that, think of A for after, you can't remember it. It just basically gets erased after a few seconds to minutes. Now there's 2 interferences, so don't get these mixed up with the amnesias. Amnesias, you have retroactive and anterograde, but interferences are things that mess up your ability to remember information. You have proactive interference and retroactive interference. Proactive is when old information blocks your ability to learn something new. Maybe you learned a password for 20 years of your life, and now you have a new password for your phone. That old password is preventing you from remembering that new password. And the opposite is retroactive. That means new information basically erases some of that old information you're trying to remember. For example, maybe you go to a new school and then somebody asks you what the name of your old school was, and it takes you a few moments to remember. Basically, that memory is slowly erased from your mind, which is retroactive interference. Now, there's a couple other things that cause forgetting, and that's encoding failure, which means that when you're trying to encode, which is pay attention and focus, distractions, maybe daydreaming or things like that, could cause that stuff to go in one ear and out the other. So, encoding failure means that you're not able to process the information into your memory, typically because you're distracted or you're not paying attention. The forgetting curve will be on there. That means that we forget about 90% of information within 7 days. The most of that information, almost about 50%, is gone within the first day. And then as the days go on, less and less gets forgotten. And then after 7 days, whatever's left kind of sticks around. Tip of the tongue phenomenon, we know what that is. That means you can describe something, but you can't really name it. It's like right there, but you can't think about it. Then we have repression. Repression means that because of trauma, your brain will kind of block or kind of erase a memory that has happened to prevent you from living that trauma again. Now, a couple memory errors I want you to know about. We have source amnesia, which means that maybe you've heard a story or a fact or a study that you saw, but you don't know where you learned it. So, for example, that could have been from a reliable scientist or your family friend or uncle. Who knows, a second grader. It's important that we know the source so we know if that information is basically reliable or not. If you're trying to say something as a fact and it came from a second grader, that's probably not a valid fact. Now, misinformation effect means that information after an experience can change how we remember that memory. So if somebody saw a robbery and somebody said, hey, did you see that person rob them with a yellow hat on? Now you think that they had a yellow hat on, even if you might not have even seen the hat that they wore. So that bit of information might change your entire memory and make it no longer true. Constructive memory means that basically we're not perfect and we fill in the gaps of our memories with past experiences or expectations or stereotypes to have a full memory. We don't want to have like a Swiss cheese kind of here and gone kind of memory. We want it to be consistent. Now, imagination inflation means that if we imagine an event happening long enough, we actually truly think that we experienced it. So if I tell myself every day that I went to an amusement park and I got chased by somebody in the parking lot, as the months go on of me thinking that, sooner or later I'm actually going to believe that happened. And then when I get older, I'll no longer know that that was an imagination, that was the truth in my eyes. And oh yes, we are just about done as we're looking at IQ, our final section at this time. Basically, intelligence is our ability to solve problems, learn from our past experiences, and to be creative. And we usually measure these through IQ tests, which we use to measure what your intelligence is and also compare your scores to other people. Now, the whole idea of measuring and testing and things like that is a concept called psychometrics. Think of metrics like a meter stick or the metric system. It's anything in psychology that we're measuring things for numbers and results and scores. So if you're taking an IQ test, psychometrics. If you're taking technically like an emotional test, psychometric. If we're measuring something in an experiment, psychometric. Now, we talked about the difference between having one IQ score or multiple. Having one IQ score gives you a nice, simple, easy number to say where you fall on average with your IQ compared to others, but it kind of limits you. Maybe you're really good at math, but you suck at reading. That's going to mess up your general IQ. But if you have multiple IQ scores, we could be more detailed, more specific. If I want somebody who is amazing as a musician, but they suck at math and they suck at, let's say, spatial awareness, that's going to have a bad IQ score. But if we use multiple IQ scores and we see how great they are at music, that's something that we can focus on as like a boss or an employee, for example. A couple of things you need to know about IQ. General IQ is a Spearman theory where you get the one score, and we like to use the little lowercase g to describe it. And how we kind of calculate that is using chronological age, which is your real age, and mental age, which is your like intelligent age. So you could be 12, but have the IQ mental age of somebody who's 15. Or you could be 22 and have the mental age of somebody who's 12, for example. And typically IQ ranges from 0 to 200, but most scores are 40 to 120. Now, we talked about having one IQ score. Let's talk about the multiple IQ scores. When it comes to Gardner, he thinks that you have 8 different ones. linguistics, which is language, mathematics, which is math, music, which is your musical ability of rhythm, melody, etc., spatial awareness, which is like visualizing objects and images, rotating them, etc., body kinesthetic, which is like your body's ability in sports and athleticism, interpersonal behavior, which is your ability to understand others, intrapersonal, which means yourself, understanding who you are, your emotions and thoughts, and then naturalistic, which is your ability to do biology and nature. So these are like the big 8 for Gardner, for example. So you can be good at math but suck at naturalistic IQ, for example. Sternberg's triarchy of IQ is 3 categories, kind of simplifying it a little bit more than the 8 long kind of IQ examples. Analytical, which is like your math, academics, and problem solving. Creative, which is your ability to make new ideas and solutions, etc. And then practical, which is like your everyday things like reading and daily functions. Now, as we move on, now we're at our final bit of this unit, and it's about what makes a good exam for psychology. Whether it's an IQ exam or something else, there's certain things that we look at. The 3 major things is standardization, validity, and reliability. The difference is standardization is the fairness. We want our exam to be fair. That means same questions, same timing, same environment, same everything. We want it all to be pretty much fair. Validity is the idea of accuracy. We want our stuff to be accurate. We want the exam to be exactly what we're looking to get answers for and nothing that we don't need. So for example, if our test is on math, we shouldn't have history or music questions on there. It should be about math, exactly what accurately we're trying to get a score on. It wouldn't be accurate if you're in a math class and everything on there is about science, for example. It's not accurately measuring what we want. Reliability is the term of consistency. So, for example, we want our scores to be similar if we took it today and tomorrow to show that our exam is pretty consistent throughout. Now, to be more specific, we have predictive validity, which is predicting the future. I want you to know this for the exam. There's something called an aptitude test. Aptitude tests are basically the names of these tests that predict the future. Construct validity, these achievement tests are called. Construct validity are tests that kind of check our current ability at something. If you're in my class and taking an exam, that's a construct validity, an achievement test. We want to see how you are right now. Do you know the content or do you not know the content? Predictive or aptitude tests, predictive validity, is when we predict the future. An ACT, how are you going to probably do when you go to college, for example? That's an example of a predicting test. Now for reliability, you need to know test, retest, split half as well. Test, retest means if you take a test and then you retake it, you should have similar scores unless you changed your study habits and things like that. Split half reliability means if we split the test in half, whether legit in half or odds and evens, we should see similar scores. So if you got 50% in the first half and 50% or 52% or something on the second half, that's pretty reliable. But if it's like 20% in the first half of the exam and 90% at the end, that's not really the best reliable, consistent exam. Now, the Flynn effect means that we basically see that IQ continues to increase over time for humans. And then a couple of terms I want to end off with is stereotype lift, which means that if we're expected to succeed at something, we typically perform better, like successful scores. We want to live up to that stereotype. But for stereotype threat, if we're expected to fail, let's say math, for example, that kind of layer of stereotype is basically going to cause us to not do as good as we can, lowering our scores. We fall into that stereotype threat. Do we fall into the threat of being our stereotype? And on this flip side, are we lifted to perform to our stereotype's expectation? And then group mindset or growth mindset means that our IQ can change with effort and practice. Fixed mindset means that it doesn't. It's stuck like that forever. Basically, these are going to be the terms that are on the exam tomorrow. I hope that this video helps you. Have a good one.